I tell this one the same way I told the ranger at Haunt's flat. Straight through. No drama, because it doesn't need any. It happened in Canyonland's Maze District on a 3-day loop. We planned to run from the Haunt's flat side down past the maze overlook toward Pictograph Fork. It was late April, right after a small shoulder storm had left the potholes shining and the air clear enough that the Henry S. looked cut from paper. We had permits. We left our itinerary with the ranger. We carried paper maps in a zip bag, a compass, extra water, a short rope for pour-offs, first aid basics, and a tin pie pan for our cooking fire so we wouldn't scorch the rock. 2 of us. I'll call my partner we're desert people, not experts, but careful. We leave notes on dashboards and on ranger desks. We eat on our feet and keep track of the sun. Day 1 went the way you want a maze day to go. The track out from Hans's flat was the familiar washboard. Slow, rattling, with the feeling that your truck is working harder than it looks. We parked where we said we would, left our info on the dash, shouldered packs, and stepped onto wide slick rock that catches your foot in all the right ways. Every shallow basin we passed had some life in it. Tadpoles wiggling in brown tea, a film of pollen skimming the edges, dragonflies strafing the mirrored sky. We walked in the habit we've built from miles elsewhere. We spoke when we needed to and shut up when we didn't. The Chirons were what they usually are out there. Occasional spare, just enough to confirm what the map and the land were already saying to your gut. We took a long look from the overlook and then started down in the late afternoon, aiming to camp high enough for a breeze and low enough to be tucked out of line of sight. The maze folds you up like that. There's always a shadow to slide into. The first off note came quiet. We started seeing stacks of rock that were too frequent for this place. The map showed a line angling toward the drainage we needed to traverse. But the little towers jumped off that line and ran like runway lights across a slab we hadn't intended to cross. Every 10 yards, another stack. Each one tidy, each one built by a hand that had time. The spacing was the thing that put a pebble under my skin. In country like this, Chirons are a nudge, not a leash. These felt like a leash. He pointed at the map, and then at the towers, and then at the sky, which was starting to go gold at the edges. We agreed to follow the stacks cautiously until we could see the next pour-off and then reevaluate. It wasn't a bad impulse. It was getting late and the cannons, if they were legit, could save us a scramble in the morning. They didn't. They steered us clean onto a bench that narrowed like a funnel toward an abrupt pour-off, steeper than we were willing to downclimb with full packs and with wet rock below. There were no empty steps pressed into the drop. No natural weaknesses within reason. Nothing but a clean lip with fresh boot scuffs right where a person would pause to look over and think about doing something stupid. We stood there long enough to feel the trick in it. Whoever laid those stones wanted feet to land exactly here at the edge, burned daylight, and then backtracked tired in the half-light. We took photos in our heads and turned around, moved back along the Chiron line, and looked for where we'd let those little stacks talk louder than the map. It didn't take long to find the soft turn where the true route had been abandoned for the neat wrong constellation. On the way back, we passed a legal water cache we'd clocked earlier. One of those ranger-approved drops a party will stage if they're redoing a long loop with sparse water. It had been there at midday, snug behind a ledge with a name and permit number scrolled on the box and a note tucked inside listing contents. It was standard bottles, a couple of meals, a roll of tape. When we found it again, the lid was kicked in and the bottles were slashed with a knife or a sharp rock. The food was scattered, the note was gone, or maybe shredded and carried on the light breeze because I didn't find even a corner of it. There were boot prints around the cache and boot prints around our packs where we dropped them to scout the pour-off. Our packs had been touched and opened, hip belt pockets unzipped, a stuff sack cinched wrong, but nothing was missing, which was worse in a way. Standing there, I realized I had been moving my eyes across this country like usual, checking for weather, landings, the line of travel. I hadn't been thinking about people. We made camp tight that night in a shallow alcove under a low overhang store with varnish. It wasn't a place you'd notice from a distance, unless you were looking for a place to notice. We kept the fire small in the tin pan, just enough to warm water, and we used the time eating to rerun the day like a tape frame by frame, looking for the moment when someone fell in step with us. He thought it was where we stopped to wash grit off hands at a pocket that held more water than the others. I thought it was earlier, near the first stack in that over-helpful line. We agreed that the cashakes being trashed and the Kyrans being wrong felt related. We soaked bandanas, emptied sand from shoes, eased our backs into rock, and decided we'd be up before first light and put distance between us and whoever wanted to play shepherd out here. We doused the little flame and watched the ember pin pricks burn down to nothing. The first stone fell maybe 20 minutes after dark settled for real. The kind of stone a person holds between thumb and finger. It clicked once on the wall above us and skittered down the face to land in the sand at our feet. We froze, counted to 60 without speaking, and then heard another stone click from a different point along the rim. There's a way a rock sounds when it breaks free under a lizard. This wasn't that. These were flicks, lazy, like the way someone fidgets with a coin at a bar. The third stone was a little bigger and thumped the tin pan like a finger tapping a glass. I eased out from under the lip and put my cheek to the cold rock and looked up. The sky was clean and star-cut. The rim was a sawtooth line and all dark, no movement. I slid back in. We sat with our backs pressed against the wall until my legs went numb. When the voice called down, it did it the way you tell your friend they missed a turn while you were both in a car. Bored, you're on the wrong route. It said from somewhere above and to the left. That was it. No suggestion. No, need a hand. No, hold up a light. It was late enough that my watch had gone from numbers to dashes in my head, but it was somewhere between 10 and midnight. We didn't answer. We didn't move. We didn't turn on a light. We let our breathing slow down to where the only thing I heard was my heartbeat change pitch as I shifted against the stone behind me. We lasted till dawn like that. Cat naps and the kind of listening that hurts your jaw because you're clenching it without knowing. At first light, we packed silently. We cut off the false cars. We passed one stack at a time and tucked the rocks back into the general chaos of the slab. Then we stopped cutting because it was too slow and because some other party behind us didn't deserve to be caught in the same trick while we were busy rearranging pebbles. We took a clean compass bearing off a landmark we both respected on the map and decided we'd walk to that bearing whether the land felt like it loved us or not. Slick rock underfoot, low sun at our backs. We moved as if the terrain were a treadmill and we'd been told to keep a pace. The first figure showed itself mid-morning, from a mile off on a parallel bench. I clocked it as a person because of the shape, not because of any detail. Tall enough to read human across a gulf of air, wearing something light on top and darker below, pausing when we pause without any hurry about it. Then a second one appeared farther back, like a second hand that had missed the first tick, but was happy to live in the echo of it. He didn't say anything for a long minute, then said quietly, "They're not closing." He meant they were content to keep a line on us without coming close enough for talk. I felt a spot between my shoulder blades start to itch like a fly had landed. We picked up our speed. We left the most delicate places alone. Cryptobiotic crust and small islands we threaded around as careful as we could because the land didn't deserve the damage. We aimed for stone and bare sand and the clean parts of dried slick. We didn't look back much. The few times we did, the two figures had moved to match. Not closer, not farther, just there, operating on our schedule. We cut into a tight side canyon for water around noon. The kind with a polished floor and a bend that kept the sky thin, with a rock pool shaded by an awkward slab. We dropped down into it and bellied behind a boulder that had the right shape to make you feel smaller in a good way. We drank and sat with our backs pressed to cool dampness and heard the light on the water make that hollow sound it makes under an overhang. It wasn't long before boots moved above our heads. Soft scuff, the brush of grit. They moved past the boulder, paused within arm's reach, just the thickness of the rock between skin and skin, and then continued without comment. Our breath stayed shallow until they were gone, and the sound of the pool took up all the space again. He counted 60 slowly. We stayed for another 100. Then we slid out of the cut and took our bearing again, and the sun had moved enough that we had to adjust. And the land tried once more to feel like a different planet, and we didn't let it. We walked until the light went flatter, and the day stopped offering us obvious camp spots. We chose a chamber with only one exit and walls high enough to make a decision for you. It wasn't a cave. This isn't a cave story, but it was close to that feeling. A nick in the rock had left a shoulder-wide slot at one end, and inside there was enough level to lie down and enough headroom to sit, and a kind of stale smell rock holds when it hasn't moved air in a while. We didn't risk a fire, not even in the tin. We ate cold and drank little and left our boots on. The short rope we'd carried for pour-offs, we stretched across the slot, waist-high, and tied to a chalk stone on one side and a horn on the other. The idea wasn't to trap anyone. It was just to tell our ears something before our skin got the message. We pulled our packs close, not because the packs would save us, but because distance was information, and we wanted the information close. Near midnight, somewhere in that time when your body wants to claim it's tomorrow, but your brain knows it's still the same day, the line snapped with a dry sound, and a mass hit the slot hard. It was a body. You know the difference between a pack and a person the second something you've tied touches them. The air changed in a way I can't explain without sounding like I'm straining for effect. It smelled like sweat, an old canvas, and something metallic. We didn't wait to see where the hands were. We did what we'd rehearsed. Shoulders low and forward together through the narrow, forcing everything in front of us to decide whether to fall or stand. The intruder had come and crouched. Our shove sent them backward onto their hip, and then onto their side, and then onto slick rock outside. We heard palms hit grit and a half-swallowed sound, not pain exactly, more like indignation, and we ran the opposite direction up a sandstone ramp we'd scouted in the last light. It was one of those tilted plates with enough friction to feel like a friend and enough angle to punish a bad foot. He went ahead by half a step, and I followed every placement his feet made, because if I tried to invent my own right, then I was going to invent a mistake. We put space between us and that chamber, enough that we felt the air change again from boxed into open. We didn't stop until the land forced us to. We crouched in the lee of a rounded bulge and let our lungs catch up with our legs. No one chased, or if they did, they didn't choose our path. We stayed there until the stars slid down to a place where the horizon thought about being a line again. Then we went up the last pitches toward the exposed stone above the maze overlook. I knew the road was close because the land stopped trying to hide it. Your body picks up on small things, random shade from signs of old tire paths, scuffs where boots have slipped more often than everything around them, a feeling of scale that matches your memory of how big a truck looks under a big sky. The first truck we saw wasn't ours. It was parked at askew with one wheel rocked against a stone. Its windshield was dusty in a way that made me think it hadn't moved since yesterday afternoon. Two men stood on the far side of it with their arms at their sides, looking up at us the way you look up when you know you read being seen and you read deciding what that means. I recognized them by their shape, not their faces. The distance wasn't long, but it had the power to stretch. They didn't wave. We didn't either. We crossed the final slabs toward the road without ceremony. The truck didn't move. The men didn't follow. He didn't turn his head as we passed, and I didn't either. I didn't need anything else from them, not their eyes and not their mouths. We hit the dirt of the road, and I heard something shift in my chest. Relief, or just the familiarity of rubber on gravel in the near future. That's when we heard the other engine from farther out. The Ranger rig announced itself the way it always does, grinding and complaining and steady. Dust followed it like a thought that couldn't catch up. The Ranger we'd spoken to 2 days earlier climbed out, took one look at the two of us, and then took a longer look at the two men by the truck down the way. He didn't ask a question like, "How's it going out there?" He asked where we'd been and why we were a night overdue. We told him. We gave him distances and bearings and the locations where the cairns turned wrong. We described the cache and how it looked when we first saw it and how it looked later. We gave the names that had been on the box. We didn't accuse anyone of anything the law would argue about. We just put facts on a calm table one by one. The way you lay out what you've carried so someone else can inventory it. The ranger listened like he was trying to not miss a part he'd regret later. Then he said something that put everything in a row. They'd had complaints all season about caches being destroyed in a specific pattern and about guides. He said the word like he was scraping it off his tongue, laying decoy cars to push parties off mapped lines. Nobody had been seriously injured yet, not yet. The problem had been catching someone doing it without turning the back out into a checkpoint. You can't stake every bend in this place with a uniform. You can barely stake the road. He asked if we wanted to file a formal statement at Hans's flat, or if we'd rather hand him a quick write-up and get on with getting home. We said we'd come in. It felt wrong to leave the thing half said. We dropped packs into our truck and followed him out in a small convoy. The road back didn't feel shorter, just because the cab smelled like salt and sunscreen and the stale sweetness of crushed granola. It felt like what it was, long and necessary. In the little ranger building, we sat at a wooden table and put the day on paper. We drew a sketch of the wrong cairn line and where it funneled onto the lip. We noted the time the stone started falling and what the voice had said. We described the one exit chamber and the rope and the contact. The ranger asked for details that surprised me. What color E's shirt had been when we passed the water pocket. Whether the truck at the overlook had a cracked corner light. Whether one of the men had a limp or an imbalance to his gait. He asked if either man had called out again when we passed by at the end. He asked if we had any reason to think we were targeted specifically or if we were just next. We went home. Work was waiting. The desert quiet folded up behind us like it does. 2 weeks later, the ranger called. He said citations had been issued after they found the same two men camped on a bench not far from where we'd heard the stones. The men had a little camp not much different from anyone else's except for the pile of broken plastic and aluminum from raided caches shoved under a lip and a wirebound notebook with a map copied poorly from an NPS Tobo. The notebook had dates, car plates, and shorthand notes on routes, who went where, which cairn lines had drawn people off, which had failed, and what had been harvested from boxes. Guides had been the word they used for themselves in the margins. Not guiding anyone to safety, guiding them into delays, deadfall, dry miles. The ranger asked if we wanted copies for any reason. We said yes, because part of me needed to hold evidence the way you hold a rock you tripped on. Feel it, measure it, put it somewhere so you don't forget it exists. What I remember most about that phone call is what the ranger didn't do. He didn't tell a story about motives and he didn't build a theory. He said they'd hit the men with everything they could hit them with, which wasn't much, and that they were banned for now from the park. He didn't lie and say that meant we'd never have to think about people like that again. The land is too big to make that promise. He said they were stepping up patrols where they could and quietly sweeping decoy stacks when they found them. He said he was sorry about the night we had. E and I taped a photocopy of the notebook's map into the back of our own. Not because we needed the pen scratches that marked their decoy corridors. They were a mess, and the desert is better than mess, but because it helped keep the thing honest. When we go out now, I run my finger over the ghosted pencil lines once and then close the book, and it's enough to remind me what a human hand can do out there when it's bored or mean or hungry for control. We still carry a compass and paper, and we still trust the way the country talks to you if you slow down and let it. We still step around the crust and cross on stone and try to leave as little as we can. There are a few images that settle in the mind from a story like this and stay. One is the cash box with its lid caved, water bleeding into the sand like something wounded, the boot prints circling just a circle. Another is the lazy clack of those small stones on varnished wall in the first hour of night. Annoying more than threatening, like a neighbor tapping a wall just to check if you're awake. A third is those to men by the lone truck doing nothing, hands at their sides, letting us see them the way a coyote will stand in a field and make your house dog go crazy behind a fence. None of those moments are dramatic on their own. Together, they made a line that pointed at the same thing. Someone had enough time to be patient and enough emptiness inside to want to herd strangers off the map for the pleasure of it. We didn't get hurt. We didn't even lose gear. That thin wind is what I keep in my pocket when I tell this. The land doesn't care if you tell it or not, but people do. So, here is the plain report. For anyone who walks in the maze, and for anyone who stacks a rock thinking they're helping. The Karen you build might keep a person on the path and it might not. The only honest Karen I trust out there is the one the map has already prepared me to find. If you see too many stacks too close together, it's not the park suddenly deciding to love you extra, it's a person. If you find a box crushed where a bottle should have been waiting to take the ache out of someone's throat, that's a person, too. The desert gives you the truth more often than not. People hide it. When we finished writing the report at Hans's flat, the ranger took our pages and said he appreciated how we walked it through. He looked tired in the way people look when they want to be everywhere at once and can't. He asked if we needed anything, water, a place to sit before the drive. We said no. We left and rattled back out the road. We stopped once to stretch our backs and watch a small storm scribble itself across the far plateau. On the rear glass of our truck, the dust had collected in a way that kept the shape of our fingers from the morning we set out. To print side by side, we didn't wipe them off. A month later, we took a shorter trip, different district, different rock. The map lived where it always lives, folded with a crease turned soft by years of sweat. The photocopy of the notebook, those pencil scars where someone had planned to make us late, lived behind it like a thin shadow. I don't carry it because I need the warning. I carry it because it's proof of what you can survive if you stay with the facts and keep your feet under you. Somewhere on a shelf, there's a pie tin with a ding where a stone dropped on it from a low rim that night. And if you hold it up to the light just right, you can see where the metal is scuffed bright. That's enough. That and the simple memory of the sound of a rope going tight across a slot and the weight of a stranger tipping backward into the open, choosing in that second to leave us alone. We made it out. That's all this is. If you want the coordinates, the exact bearings, the angle of the sun, when we decided to ignore the tidy stacks and take the line the map had promised, I have them written down, but the part that matters fits into one sentence and doesn't need a compass. The humans tried to hurt us someplace we hadn't chosen to go, and the country let us say no. We stepped where stone would hold us. We kept the light off when the voice came down, and when the line snapped, we moved together and didn't look back. A ranger met us at the road, and later, someone put a piece of paper in our hands that said we hadn't imagined any of it. That's the whole of it. We came close to being late forever. We weren't. We kept the photocopied map because sometimes you need to see the pencil to believe the story. And because there are lines, it feels good to own without ever walking them again. I picked Al Royale because I wanted quiet that didn't feel empty. I'd done a few crowded national parks over the summer and spent more time waiting at trail junctions than actually walking. A friend told me the Minong Ridge was different. Exposed rock, scrubby spruce, long, dry stretches with no one in sight. He also said the shelters near Rock Harbor felt like a different island, screened and right on the water, with loons calling at night and a boardwalk that made your legs think you weren't really back in civilization. That sounded like the ending I wanted after a hard traverse. A few easy miles around Scoville Point, a last look at Superior, and then a ferry ride back to the mainland. I booked the seaplane because I like the idea of appearing out of nowhere and dropping into the middle of things. Shoulder season meant fewer people and a better chance at getting shelters without planning around other folks' schedules. The ranger at window ran through the rules and the reminders. Keep food in the shelters or hung properly. Not because of bears, but because the red squirrels would chew through a pack like it was paper. Moose everywhere, wolves seldom seen, but sometimes heard. Keep your footprint small. The weather had that Lake Superior shrug to it. Gray water, pale sky, then a bright hour, then wind, then stillness. I walked out of the station with the paper map folded to show the Minong line. Dates penciled next to the camps I thought I could make. And that loose feeling that comes at the start of a big loop when the biggest concern is whether your socks will dry on your back while you hike. I camped the first night at Washington Creek, enough to stretch the travel out of my legs and watch the creek move through the brush at a steady, unbothered pace. The shelters, they were clean and the screens intact. I fell asleep listening to something step through wet ground in unhurried intervals. In the morning, there were cloven prints deep as teacups in the mud. I ate oatmeal, shouldered up, and headed onto the Minong under a sky that couldn't decide its mood. The Minong did exactly what people say it does. It rides bone. You climb up onto exposed ribs of rock and walk the seams where lichens and blueberry keep their grip. Then drop into low, wet pockets that smell like tannin and last year's leaves. Karen, stay honest. When the wind comes, it comes clean. In the quiet slots, mosquitoes still find you even in the shoulder months. My plan had me pushing long on the second day to get a buffer. But I felt strong and the weather was pretending to be on my side. So, I stretched it. I saw two people that day, a couple in their 50s, split between an old green pack and a new red one, moving slowly and smiling like they had nowhere else they needed to be. We traded water notes and parted. They mentioned wolves on the ridge the week before, just prints and a scat the size of a curled fist. I kept my eyes on the ground after that, partly to see the sign and partly to keep from rolling an ankle. The Minong punishes lazy feet. That night at North Dessauer went quiet early. The lake was flat and colorless like poured steel. I cooked under dull light and watched a single loon run a tight circle past the shore with no sound except the small pour of its wake. I slept hard and for too long and woke with that sudden urgency to make miles because you've messed up your start. I got moving before first full light. The wind picked up. Weather rolled through by late morning, a wet push that soaked my sleeves and hissed off the undergrowth. It moved out as quickly as it came. That's the rhythm out there. If you stop every time Superior threatens, you'll never get any distance. I felt the island loosening its grip as I got closer to the east end. The trail math changes where everything feeds toward Rock Harbor. Out on the Manong, you can go 3 hours without seeing anyone. Near the junctions that lead down to Daisy Farm or 3 Mile, you start to see fresh boot edges in the mud. Cut pine shavings where someone cleaned up a stick for a tarp line. The bright corner of an energy bar wrapper that escaped a pocket. I figured I'd stay one more night somewhere near the point, take the loop out to Scoville in the morning, then wander back along the shoreline until it felt like time to pack it in and wait for the ferry. On the third day in the early afternoon, I met a man who didn't suit the place. I was cruising a dry stretch following low carriages across Reindeer Dillon when he came into view ahead as if he'd been set down from a helicopter onto a clean part of the rock. He was older than me by 20 years at least, spare with that narrow shoulder frame you see on long-distance hikers, but he wasn't carrying a pack. He had a day belt with nothing on it, no water bottle, and a ball cap that should have been wet from the squall, but sat crisp and dry. He said hello with friendly volume like he was used to talking to people at a distance. I stopped because you do, because you trade notes, because that's part of the deal out there. He said he was doing research. I asked if he was with the Park Service or a university. He smiled and said, "Oh, just research," like he'd said enough. He asked me where I'd come from that day, and I told him the junction just west of Mount Ojibwe, and that I was thinking of pushing down to Daisy Farm or maybe beyond if the legs held. He repeated the name slowly. Daisy Farm, 3M Rock Harbor. As if testing how they felt in his mouth, he asked, "Which camp do you prefer?" I said it depended on the wind. He looked east and said it would go flat by evening. He didn't have a map in his hands, He didn't have anything in his hands, and he looked dry. He kept his face pleasant, but there was a half-second lag after he asked each question like he was lining up a next one. He asked where I was finishing. I told him the ferry the following day. He repeated the ferry softly, and then nodded and thanked me for the chat as if there had been two of us. I said I'd see him around and moved on. I glanced back a couple of times over the next 100 yards. A small bandage ran along the side of his hand, white and fresh, not the saturated brown edge you get when you've been in the wet for a day. He was watching me with a neutral, patient expression. When I checked again, he was gone. The meaning has folds where someone can disappear with 2 steps, but the quiet around his going felt wrong. I reached the green stone, took the junction down toward the water, and made camp at a shelter not far from 3M. The light thinned. The wind did what he'd said it would, and lay down. I had a roof over me, mesh screens, a pine floor, and a clean view of Superior through the gap where the shoreline pinched. I boiled water for dinner under the shelter's overhang, listening to small waves tick the rocks. Another squall spit for 10 minutes and quit. I ate slowly, shook the stove dry, and set my pack against the back wall where the squirrels wouldn't hassle it. Darkness came on quick because the clouds pressed low. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and wrote a couple of notes on the map so I'd remember the small things later. The blowdown near the high K, the patch of blueberries already gone to stems. An old boot print with a smooth heel that had tracked for a mile. Basic stuff. The sound outside the screen was not a moose and not a squirrel. It was the slow, careful brush of pant thigh against soaked spruce tips. Then nothing. Then a shift of weight on boards. The shelters have a particular echo when someone steps onto the short apron. The screen door latched with a simple hook and I set my pencil down and looked up without moving my head. A hand slid along the sill like it was reading Braille, bandage white. The fingers tapped once, then found the hook and lifted and angled for the gap like someone who had tested similar hooks before. I stood up and put my boot hard into the wood. The frame jumped and clapped into its seat. The hand withdrew fast. A foot scuffed the boards. The brush rattled, faded, stopped, returned faintly, and then went quiet the way only a person trying to be quiet can. I waited a long minute with my ear to the screen. My heart made the usual overreactions. I told myself to register the details and not the adrenaline. The bandage was fresh. The hand was not gloved. The attempt on the latch was deliberate and unbothered by the fact that someone might be inches away on the other side. I set the stove and pot where I could reach them without looking. I moved my pack to the head of my sleeping pad. I shut off my headlamp and let the gray settle into a single color. Every sound outside became a statement I had to interpret. Somewhere downshore, a paddle clanked against something hollow and then fell quiet. I slept in pieces and woke with that stubborn idea that if I got on the water, I could rinse away the feeling of the hand. At first light, I left a simple note in the shelter log. Bandage hand at screen late, and carried my empty pack into Rock Harbor to rent a canoe. The place had that outside stillness. The store was open but quiet. The deck boards had been swept, but only once. A man behind the counter handed me a form and a paddle and pointed me toward the racks. I told him I'd keep close to shore and be back by lunch. He didn't look like someone in the mood for small talk, and I wasn't either. I put the canoe in, kneeling to launch without banging it. The water had a smooth skin. A low fog lay like unrolled gauze just off the rocks. I told myself I'd sneak beneath the point, take a peek at the north side, and come back happy. The basalt shoreline there is honest. It doesn't pretend to be friendly or deadly. It's just black rock and small shelves where the spruce get a purchase and hang on. I paddled easy at first to test the boat in my head. The fog gathered in the low strips like it had purpose. I slid a dozen yards off the rocks and let the bow nose along, listening for anything that bounced sound in a way a rock shelf wouldn't. Visibility pinched down, then stretched out, then pinched again. I stayed with what I thought was the contour of the point and rounded into a pocket where the air went thick in one motion. The skiff was not there, and then it was there. Motor off, hull turned toward me. Two men stood inside it, hip to hip. They were dressed in that gray-green that meant nothing official, but looked like it wanted to. No insignia, their clothes sat to clean and to dry. I laid the paddle across the gunwales and said hello. They nodded. The one on the bow said there was a permit check this morning, and they were doing it right here because conditions were changing. He asked if I had my map and if he could look at it. The other one smiled, but kept his eyes on my hands. Nothing about them said ranger. The words were right, the posture wasn't. Real rangers were their authority like a habit. Squared shoulders, specific questions, clipped delivery. These two stood with their knees unlocked like the boat was the important part, and asked for the one thing that tells you where a person plans to be. The map with the days written on it. There was a coil of line nested in the bow like someone had been tiding it while they drifted. I could see the cut ends where the fray had been singed. The man in front tapped it twice with the toe of his boot while he looked pleasantly past my shoulder at the fog. The bowman said the weather was turning and they could run me back and save me the paddle. He said to toss the map so they could mark the closures. I told him had the closure map already and tapped the pocket where the ranger had stapled the handout. He smiled and told me to come alongside so it would be easier to talk. He didn't say please. Behind him, on the inside of the gunwale, a towel had been spread to keep a surface dry. It was the color of lodge linens. I didn't know if that meant anything then, but it stuck in my head. I said I'd hug the rocks and take a look at the next cove, then come back. He said he'd wait. I nodded like that made sense and put my paddle in with a slow stroke so the blade would end flash. The sound of the shaft against the gunwale was louder than I wanted it to be. The man in back hadn't said a word. He smiled with his mouth and not with his eyes. The bowman kneeled to move the coil closer to his side with one casual sweep of his hand. The line whispered over fiberglass. My paddle felt small. I didn't pick open water. I aimed for a narrow mouth where the rock spit in, and I held my angle even when the stern wanted to slip. The canoe scraped sideways, whispered over stone, found a pocket, and bumped forward into a slot that couldn't have been more than 2 boat lengths long. I dragged with my hands as much as I paddled, using the rock like a handrail. Behind me, the motor coughed to life, but didn't throttle up. The pitch stayed low. They were going to pace me on the outside. I kept the bow pointed at the tiniest bite of shore, where the black met the green, and didn't look back. I landed harder than I meant to, and let that be what it was. I pulled the canoe up 3 good yanks, turned it upside down on toothbrush spruce, and left it there. I didn't tie a painter. I left the paddle across the hole so it wasn't floating loose. I went inland the way a deer goes inland anywhere that wasn't water. Low spruce, blueberry on thin soil, knee-high deadfall you don't clear so much as push against. Every third step caught my shins and stapled the skin open. I told myself to keep moving until I couldn't hear the motor. I could hear the motor for a long time. The skiff chugged along the shoreline, not hurrying, just keeping level with whatever they could see and what they couldn't see. The fog was thin enough that I could glimpse the boat between trunks as I gained a little height. They didn't peel away or pass me. They sat parallel to me like a shadow you can't shake. I angled up to the ridge, thinking of the line on my map that traced the toss and wash of Scoville's Loop. I hadn't been on it before, but I knew what it would feel like underfoot. Flat rock, low steps, short open spots where the wind gets a grip. I told myself if I could get up to where the wind had a say, then the fog would thin out and I could see them and they could see me. And maybe that second piece mattered more. I found the trail by finding the only part of that country where the footed sits a half-inch lower because people use it. When you've been on lichen and blow down for 15 minutes and you step onto trail, it's like stepping onto a floor. I picked it up and went right, because right felt closer to where the harbor would be. The wind began to thin the air in pieces. The boat stayed in motion down on the water, not directly below me anymore, but not far either. They could see me when I crossed the open sections. I waved once on instinct, palm wide, like you'd signal a friend that you saw them, and all was well. Neither man waved back. The ridge leveled out and then sloped toward the point. When the loop bent, I bent with it. The wind came in, steady and cold. The fog pulled away from certain angles and held hard to others. I ran where the rock let me and walked where the roots were slick. I knew it was smartest to move fast on that rock with shins already scraped open and lungs squeezing down. But fear is a better sparring partner than smart on a lot of days. I heard the motor pause and then change tone. They were repositioning, not in a hurry, like they knew all the teeth of the shoreline. I started thinking in distances. 200 yards to the next break, 400 to the stand of taller spruce, another 100 beyond that to the first glimpse of the lodge buildings. If I'd guessed right, somewhere behind a stand of jack pine, I smelled fuel. It wasn't from their boat. It had that old shed richness, a mix of gas and oil and metal shavings. I passed a pull out on the inland side where the trail widened. A little path ran down from it. Not official. Tamped by boots that didn't care about official. On a rock shoulder the size of a tabletop, someone had drawn a grid with charcoal boxes big enough to hold numbers if you wanted to write them. The rain had smeared it, but not erased it. I didn't stop. I registered and kept moving. The sound of their motor came and went with the fog. When the wind finally took a clean bite out of all of it, I saw the harbor in one flat piece. The concession boat was there, low, wide, unlowly, and perfect, loading supplies from a dock where two workers moved with the purpose of people who do this every other day. The lodge roof sat beyond like worn-out teeth. I stood up straight out of the crouch I didn't know I'd been in and started waving both arms like a fool and like a person. I shouted something that wasn't a word so much as a hard sound. The skiff slowed, then it turned its bow out toward the deeper channel like it was remembering an appointment. I hit the last 100 yards in that ugly sprint you do when your body is 3 arguments past the point of neatness. I came down the last slick and onto the boardwalk hot and breathing high. And a man from the boat stepped toward me with a look I know well from city life. Is this my problem? And then his face changed when he saw the state of me and the way I kept looking over my shoulder at water and not at the nice lodge. He keyed a radio without asking and said a few short sentences that included the word skiff and east side and a series of numbers that meant something to someone. I leaned on a post and tried to become a shape again. By the time a ranger walked fast down the dock, the skiff was a neat line on the water shrinking into the light. He had that squared known authority I was thinking about earlier. He didn't scold or introduce himself in a way that implied everything would be fine because it had always been fine. He asked for details. He asked about the coil of line in the bow, the towel, the color of the hull, the way the 2 men stood. He asked about the hand at the shelter the night before. And when I said bandage, he repeated bandage and didn't look surprised. He asked which shelter and what time I'd kick the screen. He asked about the man on the ridge with the dry clothes and the way he repeated the names of the campgrounds. He wrote it all down in small, tight letters. I didn't ask him what they could do. I kept thinking of the line coiled right with the fresh cut ends pressed flat with heat. The ranger told me to sit, drink water, and let the shake cycle out. He stepped away for a minute and made a call I couldn't hear. A staffer brought me coffee that tasted like the same coffee I've had in 100 trail towns and lobbies. The wind had pushed the fog back like a slow tide. The lodges and dock looked ordinary again, like they never knew what had been nearby. The ranger came back and said they were going to put some eyes on the channels and see what that boat did when it thought no one was looking. He asked if I was planning to stay one more night. I said the idea had been a last easy loop around the point before the ferry. He nodded like that had been a fine idea, and maybe it still was, and also maybe it wasn't today. I moved into a shelter close to the harbor while they sorted the rest. The screen was tight, the hook, and I had that stiff bite of metal that wants to hold. I set my pack in the back corner again and felt stupid for doing it the same as before, like I could reset the night. People walked the boardwalk in 1s and 2s, and it felt noisy after the ridge, and I wanted it noisy. Late in the afternoon, the ranger came back and asked me to come see something that might help me sleep, which was a thing I would have liked to do. He led me to a small building behind the lodge where a table had been set with gear that didn't belong to gear checked out from any desk. They'd confiscated nets that weren't supposed to be on that water, the kind that sit low and patient and do ugly work with no witness. Bait buckets that had seen too much life, a pair of bolt cutters with damp black tape on the handles. A small notebook zipped in a clear bag. When he opened it, there were pages with neat lists, shelter numbers, dates, arrows, the names of a few places exactly the way the dry man had said them. Daisy Farm, 3 Mile, Rock Harbor, and numbers that mapped to them. The bandage detail matched something they'd heard 2 days earlier from a couple who had reported a man with a wrapped hand near their site at dusk, telling them he liked their setup. The ranger didn't say poachers, but the room said it for him. He said a lot of people make bad decisions in shoulder season because they think the attention is turned elsewhere. He said they had their eyes on a boat that acted like it owned the shoreline and didn't. I slept better that night because of 4 walls, because of other people, because the wind kept moving. In the morning, the ranger stopped by again with a plain thanks for reporting what I'd seen. And he said they'd sighted a skiff near Passage Island before breakfast after an interception. He said the description matched the one I'd given. He said it with the cautious satisfaction of a person who knows a citation and a cure for anything. Just a reminder that someone is paying attention. He told me I should still get my look at Scoville Point from the trail if I wanted it. I said I'd been cured of that particular curiosity for the day. He smiled without trying to talk me out of it. The ferry felt like a different country. The bench seats had a bored comfort to them. Packs piled in the corner like sleeping dogs. People compared blisters, compared weather windows, compared loons. We pushed off and made the slow turn, and the island moved by like a film you always intend to watch closely and never do. When we passed the mouth that leads out towards Scoville, I stood up and walked to the rail because something in me wanted to see the line between that morning and this one. Far off, too far to be anything but a dot, unless you already knew what you were seeing. A small boat sat at anchor. It could have been any boat. It could have been nobody, but my hands went tight on the rail, even though I told myself to relax them. A ranger stood near me. I don't know if it was the same one. He said, "They'll pay their fines and stay off the island a while." He said it casually, like facts laid in a row. I nodded. He went back to his post. The water between us and the point showed nothing besides the easy effect of wine on distance. I felt my shins start to sting as if I'd unless now given them permission to hurt. I stood there until the dot became nothing, which didn't take long. I don't have a grand way to end this. I went to Isle Royale to have an uncomplicated traverse and a quiet finish. And I got most of the traverse and none of the quiet. I am grateful to the rock along that shoreline for being hard where I needed it to be and to my legs for giving me that last burst without asking for a vote. I turned my back on the water and stayed turned. I know there are places you can love and still never go back to. This is one of them for me. I'm not from Alaska and I don't pretend to be. I work a desk job most weeks and try to stack my long weekends with trips that feel earned. I got into pack rafting 2 summers ago because it let me link hiking routes with water in the middle and because the logistics are simple if you keep your head on straight. My friend Mark is the one who nudged me toward Denali. He's the better paddler and the calmer one when weather rolls in. We went up there in mid-season because the buses run regular, the bears are busy with berries, and the big rivers are braided enough that you can usually find a tame line if you scout. Our plan wasn't ambitious. Catch a green transit bus, get off near the Taklot River, hike one of the little side valleys in until our feet were sore, float the main braids back down to a lower point on the road, then walk the gravel shoulder to whatever pull out had a bus flag and hop back on. We had dry suits, throw bags, helmets, 4-piece paddles, to alpaca boats that had already kissed plenty of gravel, a satellite messenger that we both forgot we even had most of the time, and the basic agreement that if anything felt wrong, we'd portage. No pride lost. We got off the bus late morning under a ceiling of cloud that had no shape to it, just a lid. The ridges were brown and close. The driver asked where we planned to catch him later, and I did that optimistic thing where you point with your whole arm at nothing specific and say, "A few miles down." He nodded like he'd seen this movie 100 times and told us to stand well off the road when we wanted back on. When the bus pulled away, the quiet came in fast. The toilet is a wide, pale sheet of moving silt that flickers even when it's still. We shouldered packs and walked the bar nearest the road, feeling out the texture, firm where the pebbles were large, soft where the fine stuff hung on your boots. Volve tracks crossed one bar and vanished at the water. Past the first bend, we found the mouth of a little valley that didn't have a name on our map. It held a thin creek, clear water spilling into milky. No one else was around. That fed the confidence. We climbed a bit, ate, came back down with that feeling you get when you've put in enough walking to tell yourself you've earned an easy float. We took our time rigging. I kept telling myself to act like a beginner, even if I wasn't. Dry suit zipped, PF disc snug. Knife clipped where fingers know it. Mark checked his thigh straps and cinched them, then loosened them again. He does that when he's thinking about flipping. Not fear, just rehearsal. We stood with hands on hips and watched the braids for 10 whole minutes. The flow made little V's off stones. Every now and then, a darker strip would show where a deeper thread cut through. We picked the braid that was slowest and straightest, the one that let us see around its little corners. Low angle, no wood in it, a pale tongue that told you where your bow wanted to point. We agreed to keep 10 yards between us and trade the lead so one person would be making all the choices. I slid in first. The cold reached through the suit anyway, up through the boots and past the neoprene socks. For the first 20 yards, it was that soft, eager feeling, the boat riding high and the paddle biting shallow. The channel curved left and the next bar came into view. That's where I saw it. A line across the water where there shouldn't have been one. I had to blink to get what I was seeing. It was a steel cable, maybe as thick as your pinky, strung low from willow clump to willow clump, sagging just enough to catch the current and shine where the silt had polished it clear. It wasn't a log, and it wasn't a shadow. It was metal. I yelled, "Cable," and pointed my paddle blade at it. Mark was still committed to the line I'd set. He lifted hard on his right, and the raft skated sideways. The bow kissed the cable. The vinyl hopped, but didn't grate and Mark didn't test it. He kicked himself out midstream, got 1 foot down in the shallows, and wrestled the boat up and over like he was dragging a seal. It wasn't graceful, but it was clean. We stepped onto the nearest bar and stood there breathing and listening to the cable hum. You could hear it if you let your brain settle. That faint tight note of tension pulled across water. We portaged around it because there wasn't a conversation to have. We lifted the boats above our hips so the holes would end snag and walked through willow tips that tickled the face shields of our helmets. The ground there was a mattress of old flood leaves over sand. We came across a meat pole set back from the bank. To verticals and a crosspiece all peeled of bark so clean it looked like someone had taken a draw knife to them that morning. A smear of dark brown on the dirt. Fly hum just starting. I've hunted in my life and seen meat poles used ethically and legally, but this was inside the park where those rules get specific. We didn't say anything for a minute. Mark squatted and tapped one of the uprights with his knuckles. It wasn't drifted in, it had been cut and carried. He stood up and we moved on. Back in the water, we stayed sharper than we'd been. We read the next braid short and slow and it was fine for 70 yard. Enough to breathe normal again. The channel widened and I swung my eyes side to side for more of that faint unnatural straightness. That's when Mark called out again. Lower this time, under. I looked and saw it. Another cable. This one not bright but dim like a snake under glass. You only saw it when the surface laid down between riffles. It angled under, probably pinned on one side and set to a rock on the other. We fied ashore with more urgency and stood on a bare spot of cobble to talk about it. The obvious answer was to walk back out and call the day. Our window was wide. We could stash the boats, chalk it up, but you get stubborn in the middle of nothing with nobody else around. It feels like the simplest thing to just carry 100 yards more and try again. We weren't even 2 minutes into that argument when someone shouted from the willows. Not a conversation shout, the kind that cracks and bounces. A stone hit the bow of my boat next, big enough to thunk but not puncture. It left a white bruise on the vinyl that wasn't going to go away. Ruining a set, a voice said. Broad-shouldered guy in a hood stood inside the brush line, so the leaves framed him. He was close enough we could make the shape of his jaw even under the shadow of the hood. Hands were down. I looked for a pistol in a hip holster or a long gun slung and didn't see one. Which didn't help. The way he held himself did. He was planted. We said we'd go around. We said we didn't want any trouble. He didn't move. Ruining a set, he said again like it was a rehearsed line. Mark took a slow step, put himself between my boat and the man without making a show of it. We shouldered our rafts high this time and started back upstream on a side braid, feet sliding on wet rock and silt. The man moved along with us in the willows, staying parallel. You could hear his steps when they matched ours and then not when he stopped. Once he was where I couldn't see him, and the leaves shook on their own. The only other noise was water and a gray jay calling like it didn't care. When we cut back toward the main channel again, we came face to face with another cable. This one strung so low I would have caught it across the shoulders if I had been sitting in the boat and not carrying it. It glinted a clean silver under a skim of current. We were in a little pocket of gravel with no "we're good to back out." The air felt smaller. When I say that, I don't mean metaphor. I mean the willows leaned over us and the sky narrowed to a strip. I put the boat down because my arms were shaking and not from the weight. Dump them, Mark said. He had already popped his valve covers. The boats went slack fast, wrinkling into themselves. We slid them behind a drift log with a root ball the size of a desk and pulled sand over the bright colors. I took the paddles apart and shoved the pieces deep where they wouldn't reflect. We stepped away looking like two hikers who had never been on a river. The water ahead ran knee-deep across a sheet of flat cobble and arrowed toward a longer bar that trended toward the road. You could see the rise in the distance where the highway-cut sand showed lighter than the river plain. We started for it. The cold was a bite even through neoprene. Your toes go to dull stumps and then come back as needles, all in the span of 10 steps. The current wasn't violent, but it had weight, and the silt made it, so you never knew if the next step would find a flat rock or a hole. I didn't look back at the willows. I kept my head on the line of our feet and the other bank. We were halfway across when something tugged my ankle from beneath the film of silt. Not hard, just enough to stop a step like a root. I looked down and saw a parachute cord laid flat, the same color as the bottom, tied a heavier line that ran toward one of the willow clumps. It was around my boot once. It wasn't cinched. I didn't test it. I crouched, the current pressing cold against my thighs, and slid the knife out to lift the loop off without slicing. The cord was limp, not attached to any weight that I could feel. Maybe a marker, maybe set to trip something else. It came off too easily for my hands to steady right away. Mark watched my hands and not my face. We didn't say anything because the water was loud, and there's nothing smart to say when that happens. We made the long bar and didn't stop. It was cobble like broken plates, dry where the last peak had not lapped. Every 100 yards, we stepped through a damp swale where a smaller braid had pushed recently, just enough to remind your calves they weren't done with the cold. Our boats were behind us with our names on them, and I felt stupid leaving them, even with a stone bruise and a stranger in the brush. But there's a scale in your head that tips fast when getting out moves from an option to the only thing. The shape in the willows paralleled twice more where the bank bent and let us see through. It was just the suggestion of shoulders and movement. The second time, something splashed ahead of us in a side channel, like someone testing the depth with a boot. I thought about the man stepping out on the main bar and simply standing there, not needing to swing a punch, just blocking us and waiting until light waned and options shrank again. I shifted my bear spray from the hip to my hand and toggled the safety an eighth of an inch. It felt inadequate and also like the only thing I knew. We gained a bench where the bar climbed a foot or two above the braids. The sand textured with hundreds of caribou tracks and little ovals where hoofs had sunk. The bench ran straight for a long way. From there, the highway line was clearer. A gray stripe laid on a raised embankment with willows at its toes. Now and then the shadow of a bus ghosted past on that line, and the sound reached us late. A low diesel note that came and went. It put the range of distance in my stomach. I checked my watch. It wasn't late by the numbers. Not yet, but the cloud ceiling made it feel like evening that had already chosen you. We stayed on that bench, keeping the water at our left shoulder and the willows at our right. Where the bench broke down into softer sand, we moved quiet without meaning to, like any noise would convince the river to move the wrong way. The shape in the brush didn't show again. I didn't trust that, which is its own kind of tired. We reached the crown of the last bar, and the final braid was in front of us. Wide ankle to knee, not much gradient. Past it, 10 yards of willow roots at a cut bank, then the road. The cut was the only real obstacle left. We weighted that last braid slower than we had to, because it felt wrong to rush one of the only things that was still predictable. The cut bank had a damp face like it had slumped in the last rain. We put hands into roots and pulled ourselves up. Sand caved under my boots and slid back. But there were enough woven root balls that the whole face held. I got my elbows over first, and then my chest. And then I was on the thin shoulder where the dust of the road is different from river dust. Fine, towel-like with tire chatter stitched through it. Mark came up right after. We didn't wait. We moved 30 yards down to one of the green and white bus stop signs planted at the wide pullouts and stood the way the driver told us, well off the lane with our arms out. I don't know what our faces looked like. It couldn't have been calm. When I saw the shape of the bus coming up from the west, I started waving before it made sense too, palms big and open. The driver hit the brakes like he had been expecting us. The door opened halfway and the steps creaked. He didn't make us talk at the door. On, he said, and we were. He pointed us to the front seats and handed us old wool blankets from somewhere behind his chair. I didn't realize how cold I was until the blanket hit my shoulders and everything shook like a switch had been flipped. The bus moved before I felt still. The driver picked up the radio mic and said something that I only half heard, but it included toilet, visitors on foot, and possible interference. He didn't say the word weapon, and that calmed me more than the blanket. The other passengers did that polite not looking that people do when they want to give you space. One woman slid a water bottle across the aisle with a nod. I drank half of it without realizing. Mark sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands locked together like he was trying to warm them with friction alone. When the bus rolled past the place where our boats were hidden, I couldn't pick the right clump of willows out of the sameness, which made sense. That drift log was now part of a map that only existed in my head and in Mark's. We got off at the toilet contact point. A little knot of buildings and equipment and a ranger who stepped out with purpose. He wasn't dramatic about it. He looked like everyone else there. Rain shell, ball cap, an expression that said he'd rather have the facts than the feeling. We gave him both because you do and separate them cleanly when your adrenaline is still walking ahead of you. He took notes on a write in the rain pad and then had us sketch the spot from the road in showing bends and bars like we were drawing a kid-esque treasure map. He asked about the cable specifically, height, sag, anchoring. He asked where the meat pole was and whether it looked old. When he got to the part where he needed to talk at us and not just listen, he picked his words. He said we were allowed to possess bear spray and that yes, people could have firearms in the park, but that doesn't mean you can do whatever you want with the landscape. He said setting obstacles in a navigable channel is not allowed. He said harassment is not something that gets graded on a curve just because you reel a long way from a paved lot. He used the word subsistence and then defined it in the legal way that made it clear it was a free pass for where we were. Ugh, not on that side of the boundary. Not with what we described. He told us to sit in the back room where it was warm and that he'd be gone for a bit. We didn't ask for a rescue of our boats right then. It felt like one thing at a time. We sat and listened to the radio chatter that was constant but background. Our names sounded wrong when someone else used them. After what might have been an hour and might have been 20 minutes, he came back with another ranger and a pair of bolt cutters that looked like they'd fix most problems if you could just get your hands on the right part of the problem. He said they were going to go have a look that evening if light held, and that they'd sweep at first light if it didn't. He used sweep in the way you use it on a river, a deliberate patient check. They found the cables. We didn't ride along for that, but the next day another driver told us, and then our ranger confirmed it later. 3 sets, the highest one at a height that would have caught across a chest if you'd been kneeling up to stretch your legs in your boat. One anchor was buried rebar, driven into the bank like a tent stake for giants. The bolts were clean. They cut each line once, and then twice, because the strand's frayed and metal has a way of pretending it's dead when it isn't. He said the line sprang like they'd been waiting too. He said they floated the line of that braid after, and sat where the second cable had been and tried to see the third before it showed itself. Hard to spot until you're on it. He said not to spike the fear, but to name it out loud, so the shape of the hazard was honest. 2 days later, we were asked to come by and look at a photo array and then a person. They didn't make a big ceremony of it. It was a simple, let me know if you recognize anyone. The person they asked us to look at wasn't standing special. He had the hood up again and his jaw set the same way. It was the jawline that did it for me. There's a way faces fix when they're telling you something that they think solves everything. Ruining a set, he'd said. I don't know what exactly his set was supposed to catch. Fish, fur, a person stupid enough not to look up. I didn't ask and wasn't invited to. The ranger said this guy had been warned before about stringing things across water, that warnings sometimes don't stick, and that sometimes consequences are what help them stick. He kept his voice flat enough that it didn't read as a threat or a promise, just a line in a report that would have other lines under it. We asked about our boats, which felt small by then, but also like a piece of us we'd left curled up under a log. The rangers had found them where we said, muddy, branches stuck in the valves, but intact, no cuts. The line bruise on mine had darkened the way plastic does after it's been pressed and released. They brought them to the contact point, and we went to pick them up like dog owners being reunited in a parking lot. I ran my hands along the tubes without thinking, checking for soft spots. Mark inflated his to half pressure to make sure the valves weren't packed with grit. We deflated them again and shouldered the weight the way you do when you want to feel it and also be done with it. On our last ride out on the bus, we passed the bend where we'd set in that first time. The light was better that day, sky higher, ridges showing more detail. I leaned across Mark to look, expecting stupidly to see some trace, a cut willow end, a shine, a human mistake left visible. The water was clean of straight lines. The willows looked like willows. You would never know. The driver kept his eyes on the road and called out a caribou off to the right for the photographers, and no one around us knew that my hands were shaking again. The breath I let out when we'd cleared the bend made a sound I didn't plan. It wasn't relief as much as acknowledgement. The two of us talked in low voices as the road unspooled toward the park entrance. We didn't talk about new routes or how we might do it smarter next time. We didn't turn it into a lesson with neat edges. We both said separately and then together that we were done with that stretch. Not forever with rivers, not forever with Alaska. Just that place in that line of water where someone else had ideas about what should be allowed to move and what should be stopped. That night, back in our tent, my suit hung from a line with the zipper open to dry, and Mark's boots were filled with wadded socks to hold their shape. We didn't drink a beer to shake it off, and we didn't sit up and replay every second either. I lay on my back and felt the places on my shins where the cable could have landed if the timing had been worse. The tent fabric ticked with a light wind, and somewhere not far away, a ground squirrel chirped the kind of alarm they always give for everything. It blended into the noise of the day. I thought about that man standing in the willows, about the way the word set felt in my mouth after, like it had a different weight now. I thought about metal in water and how fast cold will take your breath when it decides to press up and remind you. I felt the bench under my feet again, the caribou tracks pressed into sand, the groove of the cut bank where the road begins to be a thing you can count on. I didn't dress it up. I didn't try to make it something else. In the morning, we broke camp early and waited where the road dusted us and settled and flagged a bus without needing to wave much at all. I kept my eyes away from the river when we passed it again. We rode out that way, quiet, and when the park line slipped behind us, I felt whatever was still hooked in my chest loosen, and just enough to carry home. I won't go back to that reach of the toilet. That's the only promise that makes sense to me. I'll start with the basic facts because that's how I remember it best. I'm 40, live in Texas, and I've hiked Big Bend a handful of times over the last decade. Enough to respect the heat and the distances and not try to play cowboy with either. My girlfriend and I had been talking about doing a long dry link-up for a while. Not because it was smart, but because we wanted to see parts of the park most visitors skip. We both work odd hours and get the same itchy restlessness when we go too long without a big day outside. We picked a shoulder season window, warm days, cool nights, and built a route that would tie the Dodson country to the Marufo Viga side. It wasn't a ranger-recommended loop or anything in a brochure, just a legal exposed airless figure we drew across the map or contour lines stacked like cordwood. We filed our plan, left the usual paper with contacts at Panther Junction, labeled water jugs with our name and date, and cashed legally in block letters, and stashed them where we were allowed. We set the truck note on the dash with our route and ETA, made a point of double-checking the spare headlamp batteries, and told each other we were fine to turn around if the heat or timing went sideways. There wasn't any bravado in it. We just wanted to move through big, quiet country and come back tired. We started in the kind of morning that tricks you into thinking it's easy. The air still held a leftover cool, and the Ocado matched the sky with new green. The Dodson, as always, gave nothing for free. It draped and tilted over low passes and dropped into wide drainages where gravel shifted like ball bearings under each step. So flag our shins, prickly pear leaned in. We paced our water by the hour and tried to keep it boring, steady cadence, small food, heads down. And I remember saying out loud at one point that the light felt honest. No cloud tricks, no weird mirage shimmer, just clean hard sun. We could see the Chizos like an island behind our backs, blue and higher. And when we looked the other way, the country fell toward the river in a long collection of broken shoulders. We moved for hours like that. Walk, measure, eat, check the map, walk again. Every so often, we defined a tanaga tucked into stone where a wash turned and pulled in last season's storms. Most were dry. One held a shallow rim of water, so dark and still it looked like oil. We didn't touch it. Tina water can be salvation or sickness depending on how desperate you are and how much time you want to spend filtering what the coyotes also used last night. We had our caches, we kept moving. Around late morning, we climbed a rise and the wine pulled the smell of the river up to us. It was faint and sweet the way wet clay can smell in a dry place. We were close enough to sense it without seeing it. And when we hit the Mare Viga side, the rock underfoot changed. The ground went to limestone, pale plates over darker breaks, edges sharp enough to pry at boot soles. The trail here isn't really a trail in places. It's a logical line that generations of feet have agreed on across ledges and benches where a direct path would cliff out. The bench we took tilted toward the Rio Grande. If you stopped and stood square, you could feel that lean in your ankles like a deck under a slow swell. The river ran far below, braided and quiet in the noon glare. But the drop was still the kind that makes you keep your eyes where your feet will go next instead of trying to sightsee. We folded our trekking poles and used our hands on the steeper steps to keep our rhythm clean. Just after midday, call it 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we saw the first thing that didn't sit right. The bench turned around a low outcrop and a faint sidetrack came angling up from the direction of the river. The dirt there had a better memory than most. Finer, not as armored, and it showed 3 sets of prints with the kind of edges you only get when they renew. I don't pretend to be a tracker, but you don't need a class to know when heel cups are crisp and toe scuffs still sit on top of dust instead of wearing into it. The stride looked unhurried. All 3 were adult-sized. One person dragged a toe a little in the right foot. The line they made didn't go up and off toward the nearest pass. It merged with our bench and followed it. We didn't say anything then. We didn't need to. You keep hiking because that's the only direction that makes sense. And you take a mental note of how much food you have and how much water. And you look a little farther ahead than you had been looking. We were both moving quiet when we came to a shallow cave in the bench, more of an overhang with a back wall soot-stained by old fires. It wasn't deep enough to be shelter. It was a place to step out of the sun for 10 minutes. Just inside the lip were 3 cigarette butts pinched flat. I bent without touching them. The paper at the tips hadn't gone chalky. The tobacco looked dark, not sunbaked. One was still warm when I held my hand a few inches above it. That kind of detail is simple and stupid. It's just the truth of the last 5 minutes, but I've learned that those small things are the ones that stick in your gut. Next to them, half buried in loose dust, was a plastic tote with the lid crooked and the hinge jammed with a pebble. Nothing spilled out, nothing labeled. I didn't open it. My girlfriend turned her head and looked at me, and then looked back down the bench as if we just decided to skip a viewpoint. We backed away. The bench cut around another corner and straightened. That's where we saw them. 3 men stood in the bright 100 yards ahead, spaced just enough to see one another's hands without touching. They didn't jump or look surprised. They also didn't step to block the line. One lifted a hand radio without looking at it and tapped the side with a finger like you'd check if it was awake. There's a kind of conversation you can have at that distance without words. It's the math of how many, how far, which way the ground tilts, where the shade is, and how much time is left in the heat. We stopped walking without making it a big thing and angled up onto broken rock above the bench, as if that had been the plan all along. Nobody said a word. The men didn't call out. They watched us the way you watch antelope from a fence line. The only sound was wind above the bench. The slope went bad fast. The rock up there wasn't laid flat by any kindness. It broke into dinner plates, and the plates rode on ball bearings. Lechugia hit its points at knee height and slid a needle into your calf if you stepped without checking. We started up and across, committing to a higher line that would, with luck, link a ledge to a weakness we'd seen on the map, where the bench pinched to a notch. It wasn't elegant. It was the kind of side hill where every crossing footfall wants to fold the ankle of your downslope foot, and the UPS slope foot begs for more purchase than the rock will give. I took my gloves out and put them on us to have the reminder to keep my hands open and low. We didn't run. You can't run that terrain without going faster than your brain. We traded the idea of speed for the idea of simply not making a mistake. We felt them behind us without looking. The men taking our line as far as the bench would give it, matching distance step for step. Heat came down like pressure. The sun leaned to afternoon, but there was nothing soft about it. I could feel sweat opening at my temples and drying faster than it should. We sidestepped toward a smear of shadow under a block, took 10 long breaths each, and crossed a pocket where the limestone had turned to small, sharp chips that slid under our boots and rattled downhill like dry rain. Every sound felt too loud. I tried to keep my breathing quiet. That's not a rational thought. I did it anyway. The notch we had gambled on was one of those features that reads easy on a map and shows you its teeth when you stand at it. The bench narrowed to a tilted ledge, then pinched to a waist width gap where a piece of the wall had sheared away and left a slot with the river as the clean, empty answer if you got it wrong. The rock there was smooth from thousands of years of water that wasn't there anymore. There was just enough purchase to smear a boot and just enough roughness to catch your fingertips. On the other side, the bench opened again to ugly but honest stepping, tilted and broken. But at least it wasn't a cliff. We did the math fast, backtrack and meet 3 men on level ground with a radio, climb it to a passage they might not want to try. We didn't talk. I put my pack on tight, took my right pole and collapsed it and slid it through the strap so I'd have both hands. My girlfriend did the same. We moved down to the slot on our butts, kept our hips close to the wall and started the cartoon version of walking, shoulders and toes to the right. Left foot across, left hand to the wall, slide, set, right foot across, right hand to stone. We didn't hug the rock because you can't breathe when you do that. We kept a point solid and one moving. Halfway across, I felt a plate under my right foot tilt and whisper. It had that sand on glass feeling where you know you lines be okay if nothing else compounds your mistake. And then it compounded. The plate slid out from under me, tipped over the edge, and took its time going. It dropped clean for seconds that felt like a half hour. And then we heard a slap from the river like a child smacking the surface of a pool with a flat hand. The sound had a delay long enough to imagine the space it fell through. When I looked up, all 3 men stood at the start of the notch. They didn't flinch at the rock going. One bent his head the way you do when you're listening to someone speak into your shoulder. I saw the antenna of the radio. They spoke quietly among themselves and didn't start onto the slot. We finished the traverse with that deliberate slowness you only find when you've run out of extra moves. When my girlfriend stepped off the far side and onto easier ground, I felt my knees let go a little. The men stayed put. One of them slid his fingers at the beginning of the notch in a measuring sort of way. I don't know if he was checking width, grip, or thus giving his hands something to do. Then the trio split without announcing it. One turned and started down toward the river, following the line of the bench back to the place where the sidetrack came up. The other 2 angled up slope into the same ugly we just bled through, aiming not at the notch, but at the top of the shallow gully on the far side of it, an interceptor line. It made sense. If we kept our lateral line, they'd meet us where the gully pinched into the next bend of bench. There was a kind of professional patience to how they moved, and that bothered me more than anything. No rush, no posture, just the steady assumption that time and heat would make us simple. We turned into the gully and climbed it fast enough to sting our lungs. The gully was shallow and choked with loose rock, the sort where every larger piece you think about trusting turns out to be perched on smaller pieces that had loved to go together. We made for a ledge shaped like a broken tooth and used it to step out of the gully and onto the next slab of bench. I checked the time. It was a little past 3 in the afternoon. The day had done that thing Big Bend days do, where the sky goes white at the edges and the ground radiates its own weather. My mouth had that cotton texture you get when you rewrite on the line between enough water and not enough. Our plan had been to hit a tennis marked on the map before evening. The map note just said reliable in wet years. We were not in a wet year. We adjusted our plan to a version where we hoped the rock would be generous. I don't remember deciding to be quiet, but we both muted the usual trail talk. Part of it was inventory. I counted sips and food and measured what it would cost us to keep moving to the Taja versus sheltering badly and waiting for dark. Part of it was terrain. You need your breath to move right when every step is a small puzzle. Part of it was the presence behind us, to figures framed against sky when we risked a glance back, the nothing when we moved along a wall that hid them for a while. I can't prove they were where I thought they were at every minute, but there were enough small signs, the bounce of a rock lower down that we didn't kick loose. A scrap of radio squelch carried up the gully like a mosquito that I would bet my truck I am not misremembering. We hit the Tinaga as the light went from white to the color it turns when the day finally believes it's evening. It was a bowl carved into the limestone where water collects when there's any to collect. We came down a rounded lip and it was there. Slick dark water, be 3 feet across, deeper than it looked. Something had drunk from it recently. There were fresh small tracks at the rim. Fox or coyote, I couldn't tell. We slid our packs off and took kneeling sips like we were at a church font. Then filtered into our bottles as fast as the filter would work. We didn't make it a picnic. I refilled the bladders, checked the cap seals twice, and we put the packs on again while still breathing hard. We left no trash and no sign. We had a short, quiet talk about what came next. We could sit tight and let full dark come, which would make our lines slower and riskier on that kind of ground. Or we could push into the dusk and use the moon when it rose. The sky was clean. No clouds, no threat of weather. So, we chose to keep moving on the faint tread that would bend us back toward the Marufo Junction. In that kind of light, a headlamp is a tiny lighthouse you carry on your forehead. It's also a flare that says, "Here I am." To anyone looking from a distance, we kept lamps off as long as we could, reading the ground by feel. And by the way, a trail knows how to talk to your feet. Where the tread widened, we took it. Where it broke apart across shelves and ledges, we paused and let our eyes unfocus enough to see the smoother options, then took them. Night settled with no flourish. It just arrived. The moon took its time, but once it cleared the horizon, it gave us a usable wash. We fell into that small, tight beam of attention that night. Hiking builds, light, step, breath, scan, repeat. We heard the river sometimes as a low hush when the bench shifted closer and the drop grew. We heard birds settle and the dry click of something small scuttling off the tread as we came. Coyotes tinned a note in the next drainage over, far off, louder than it should have been. An engine, maybe a ranch truck, maybe a patrol. It had that flat, unhurried sound of someone who knows exactly where they are and doesn't need to prove it by the way they drive. Sometime around 9, we reached ground that quit slanting like a trying to throw you carnival ride and started behaving like a path again. The Marufo Junction came in not as a sign, but as a set of options that looked maintained in the way only official miles do. The world changed from careful cross-country to trail. My shoulders dropped. We still moved like we were being watched because that's how the day had taught us to move. We didn't see the 3 men again. The notch had taken more courage or more need than they wanted to spend, and they had rewritten their plan the same way we had rewritten ours. I don't pretend that meant we were safe. It meant we had one less immediate decision to manage. Our last miles to the backcountry site were the kind where time both stretches and goes missing. We started speaking again, and the tone was the practical kind you use when you've said enough by not saying anything. Left at the Chiron. Watch her off foot here. Drink. How much do you have? Eat something. I apologize for how boring this part sounds. That's exactly how we wanted it. The moon did the same work over and over, silvering the edges of rock and giving just enough contrast to catch steps before they turned into mistakes. I kept looking for any new light behind us. There wasn't any. We crossed a dry wash with a floor so hard it reflected our soft footfalls back up at us like hollow knocks and climbed out to meet a line of creosote that meant we were close. We stumbled into the site well after midnight, call it 12:45, and almost walked past it because it was just a flat legal patch a few yards off the path with a small windbreak stacked of stone. A volunteer truck was parked nearby, tailgate down. Boxes half stacked in that way you do when you re-mid-chore and take a break to stretch your back. The volunteer was a man, be in his 60s, with the look of someone who had spent a lot of years outside and didn't need anyone to watch him to keep him honest. He turned when he heard us, and I saw the split second where we went from shapes to 2 tired hikers. He didn't ask how was it or any of the safe small talk. He asked if we needed water first. It was a smart question. We did. He handed us 2-gallon jugs without flinching at how fast we drank. We told him the simple version. Bench, 3 men, radio, notch, and watched his face flatten the way people's faces get when they put a piece into a picture that already existed. He didn't look surprised or nervous. He looked like a mechanic who'd heard a specific rattle before. He asked for landmarks. We gave them. He asked for timing. We walked the day back through out loud. He said he was headed to Panther Junction anyway to restock. If we didn't mind throwing our packs in the bed, he could drop us with the rangers on the way. We didn't mind. It felt wrong to sit down in the truck after so much day. But the wrongness passed. The cab smelled like dust and coffee. The headlights smelled a low arc of brush and road. And then the building lights came up ahead. At the ranger office, the air felt too cool and clean after the day's heat, like a hospital corridor does after a hot parking lot. The duty ranger took our statement with quiet focus. We pointed at the map until we found the exact curve where the notch made sense and the shallow gully pinched. We described the overhang, the cigarettes, the plastic tote half buried with the lid off. We made our best guess at the time we heard the rock plate find the river. My girlfriend remembered the way one of the men had spilled his fingers toward the slot, not reaching for it, just measuring. The ranger wrote all of it down. He asked if we had photos. We didn't. There hadn't been a moment where fishing out a phone would have been smart. He didn't push. He nodded, said they had been watching increased foot traffic along that bench. Said public safety and resource protection lived in the same paragraph in this corner of the park, and that they appreciated the details. He gave us a card with a number on it, practical and unceremonious. He asked if we needed a place to sleep. We said we'd figure it out. He said he believed us. It shouldn't matter to hear that. It did. We slept badly on the floor of a cheap room that night, the kind with thin carpet and a humming unit that can't decide if it wants to cool or heat. Every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see the men. I saw the tilt of that bench and the piece of rock slipping from under my boot, and I felt the kind of stillness you only get right before a mistake becomes a fall. The next day, we did the usual cleanup that happens after long days. Shook sand out of everything, counted what we had left of food, poured what was left of our water. We tried small talk, and it felt hollow. We drove the park roads to let the picture of the country get big again instead of being narrowed to a single shelf above a river. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with an unknown number while we were eating something tasteless and perfect. Eggs and toast at a place with a sticky counter. It was the ranger. He said a separate patrol had gone out along that line where we'd put our finger. They'd found the plastic totes and a lookout spot above the notch marked with smooth stone set just so on an otherwise rough shelf. A little platform where you could see the approach without committing to the slot. The men were gone. The cache was seized. Patrols would intensify for a while on that corridor. He thanked us for the landmarks again and said something quiet about how the park was big but not empty and that most people moved through it, wanting what we had wanted. Distance, a good tired, but some moved through it with other plans. None of it sounded like a speech. It sounded like someone doing the job that comes after other people do theirs. We packed the truck and left in the long morning shadow that falls off the Chizos like a tide, blue and slow. We drove past Ocado that looked like a line of metronomes and past flats where the light made gravel look like tin. The road unwound and the park got behind us in the rear view. My girlfriend dozed with her hat pulled low and I watched the white edge of the mountain slide along the window. I didn't try to make it into any kind of lesson. I didn't say we'd learned anything. I thought about the bench, the tilt under my boots, the way 3 men stood, and watched without needing to say a word, and how they were willing to let heat and time do the work for them. That was enough shape for the memory. When people ask me if we'll go back to Big Bend, I say yes without thinking. It's part of my home map in that private way places become yours after you've sweated and gone quiet there. When they ask if we'll go back to that particular shelf above the river, I don't wait as long. I say no. I can still feel that limestone trying to roll me off like I was a bad idea, and I can still see the 3 of them standing in the bright, patient as the afternoon. We finished our loop. We got to walk out on our own feet. I won't go back to that bench. Music, I'm not from Washington. I live 2 states away and fly up when a friend dangles something that sounds worth the red eye and the rental car. Copper Ridge had been one of those names I'd heard from people who hike more than they talk. A thin line of trail running the spine between the Nooksack and the Chilliwack, a lookout high enough to feel like a ship's mast, and a river crossing that changes character every season. I'd done desert loops and alpine traverses, carried a pack raft on my shoulders for miles to float an hour of cold water, but I'd never been on that ridge. My two partners for the trip were Jacob and Lena. We know each other well enough to share a tent without hating each other by morning. They're steady. No one tries to be the hero. We got the permits, printed the itinerary, and borrowed a 50 feet length of static rope from a climber friend who swore we wouldn't need it, but said it made his risk brain calmer if it was in our pack. It made mine calmer, too. We flew in, hit a grocery in Bellingham, drove the washboard to Hannigan, and started up under a sky that looked as if it had made a quiet deal with itself to stay calm for a few days. The trail rose through alder and fir, the kind of switchbacks that get into your breathing but don't feel like a fight. The valleys below looked parked and empty, like somebody had turned off a motor. We passed a handful of day hikers near Hannigan Pass, and then it thinned out. The three of us have a rhythm. Lena takes the lead on climbs. I settle in the middle and Jacob sweep because he sees things we miss. An early huckleberry, a set of paw prints soft in a shaded patch, a trickle you'd walk past and regret later. That first day, we pushed out along the ridge toward Sija and Copper. The views opened the way the first page of a book opens. Even with stable weather, the air had that brittle edge you get near glacial ice, a smell like metal and cold stone. We made the kind of time you make when you train right and nothing hurts yet. Near Copper Lake on a stretch where the trail runs through open heather and then dives into thin timber, we saw the man. He came up from the other direction with a short, neat day pack and the kind of clothes you wear to look like a hiker when you don't intend to sleep outside. Clean pants, no belt, running shoes that weren't made for scray. He wasn't dirty. That was the first thing that hit me, because everything up there puts dust on you. He stepped aside for us, nodded, and asked casually which site we'd pulled for the night. It wasn't a how's the traffic up there kind of question. It was the exact phrase. Which site did you reserve? He smiled, but didn't show teeth. I said we weren't sure yet, just that we'd see what was open below the lookout. He fell in behind us for maybe 100 yards and then peeled off into a little side path toward the lake, as if he'd remembered. He forgot something. When I glanced back a minute later, he was standing still with his head turned as if he could hear a thing I couldn't. We made the lookout around mid-afternoon and found a pair of brothers already there. Good guys. They offered water from their filter, and we traded a couple of packets, coffee for peanut butter, and then gave them the space that lookout visitors pretend is privacy. We dropped lower toward a signed camp and got lucky. A flat site with a view through subalpine fir to the shoulder of the ridge. We cooked early because we weren't really hungry. We were trying to bank chores before the wind picked up. By 5:30, we had food down, trash packed, and the bare canister wedged against a down log where it couldn't roll far. The light had gone that clean, slanted way it does above Treine, where every scratch in the bark throws a shadow. I walked down with Lena to refill bottles at a seep that crossed the trail in thin strings. We didn't bring headlamps because we were only going a couple 100 yards. On the way back, I felt something touch my shin like a nettle, then it bit and tugged. A split second later, bells jangled in the brush to my right, tinny, about the size you'd hang on a cat's collar. I looked down and saw what caught me, a clear filament strung low across the trail between two dry heather stalks, taut enough to bite skin, hard to see except where it sliced a line of dust from my leg. The filament led to a little stem bent like a bow. The bells were tied off on a branch that sprang back and jangled again, one long rattle, then little aftershocks. No joke, no prank, not something a ranger would set to monitor wildlife. It was set at the height where your calf would hit if you were hiking at dusk with tired eyes and no light. We cut the line with a knife because stepping over it felt like giving it permission to exist. When we reached camp, Jacob was standing by the bear can with his arms folded. It had moved not far, 10 feet, maybe 12, but enough that the grooves it carved through the duff made a pair of shallow parallel scars like sled tracks. There were no drag marks on the lid, no tooth or claw scratches, no paw prints bigger than a chipmunk's around the rim. If a bear had pushed it, you'd know. It looked as if somebody had rolled it, then changed their mind, then left it on its side, not far from where it started. The can itself wasn't scuffed. You could make yourself believe something natural did it, but it didn't feel like that standing over it. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We wedged the canister deeper into a crook of bark and stacked 3 wrist-thick branches against it. Not a fortress, just something you'd hear if anything moved it again. We pulled our headlamps and left them off. We sat on our pads and listened. Far upslope, 100 yards, maybe 2. Light skated through the tips of the subalpine fir. It wasn't a single slow arc, the kind of searching movement people make when they're picking through brush. It snapped short and repeated like a metronome for someone with a bad conscience. 3 quick sweeps, a pause, 2 longer passes, another pause, then 3 quick again. It could have been an accident, it could have been nothing. I could feel Lena sit nearer without touching me. Jacob said what all 3 of us were thinking. We're going dark. We killed the last of our little red tent light and breath through our mouths. After the headlamp did its pattern twice more, the ridge settled back to a shape against the sky. For a long time, the only sound was the small dry crack of something cooling in the fire ring. We never lit, and once the tick of a stone that had been held by another rock and decided to give up, we got up in the dark without talking and had camped down by first gray. You can't actually sneak with a tent and 3 people, but you can move quiet enough to make a point. We shouldered packs and went for the ridge's descent toward the river. The lookout was just a square of wood against a brighter patch of cloud. If the brothers were awake, we didn't see them. We moved on the kind of autopilot that comes out when you've already made your decision. The trail dropped into timber, switched back toward the sound of water, and carried that smell you only get where the air works full-time on wet growth. By the time the forest opened near the river, the light had a chalky edge. The footbridge was out for the season. The sign warned of it in words that tried to be calm and ended up sounding like they were tired of being ignored. The Chilliwack is not the biggest river I've crossed, but it's one of those that runs with purpose. It was thigh-deep where the trail hit it. The current came in hard from a bend upstream and threw its weight into the far bank. There was a strainer of alder where a side braid died. Branches pointing downstream like fingers. We walked the bank. We tested with poles. We found a place where the bottom felt even and the flow had a little mercy. The plan was simple. I go first unbuckled with my pack. Lena anchors my pole hand if I drift, and then we F the rope for the other 2. No heroics, no diagonal lines, just something to throw if someone went down to buy seconds and reduce the panic. We hauled out the static rope and fed it into coils we could throw. It looked too clean to belong in a river. That's when he stepped out of the alders upstream. The same man, same day. No overnight gear. He didn't say anything. He looked at us like we were a gate he had to pass through, and then he just went in. 40 yards above us where the current curled through a deeper slot that had warned us off. He took 2 decisive steps, and then his feet went. He tried to sit into it. For a second it looked like he might stand again, and then he was on his side. The pack twisting him, the water doing what water does. He slid into the mouth of the side braid and the strainer had him pinning him chest first across a tangle of branches. He was there and then he was mostly not there. Face under the pack holding his back up like a hand. Whatever else I thought about him, I moved. Jacob moved faster. He ran the bank with the rope coiled and Lena and I dropped what we had to feed him line. Jacob took 1 shot and missed. Rope landing short, the current grabbing it and drawing it tight in a long smile across the run. He pulled fast, recoiled sloppy, and I yelled, "Hi," because the only thing worse than 1 rope in that mess was 2. His second throw hit the thickest part of the branches about a foot from the man's shoulder, and the line sank into the tangle with its own weight. The man didn't do anything that looked like reaching. I don't know if he heard us, he was coughing, or the river was making the noise for him. Lena and I set the coils around our hips and braced backward, feet in the bank, and Jacob strained the line like we were trying to drag a log against a current. It wasn't a rescue line. It wasn't tied to anything. It was friction and hope. We yarded. The rope bit into the branches, then sawed free. The man came with the roll of it, one shoulder slipping, then his chest, then his hip, and he spun loose into the main push. He came up long enough to cough and stand on a slick rock like a newborn animal. And then he ran, not to us, not to help, not to look. He ran for the far bank, splashed through to a shallow, found sand with his feet, and limped at speed into the trees. No thank you, no glance back. He moved like a guy who knew where he was going and had already decided the part we played. We stood with wet shins and the rope in our hands and listened to our breathing hit the trees. Then we crossed because waiting there felt worse than moving. We did it the way we planned. Slow, unbuckled, facing upstream one at a time with the other to plant it on the bank as a bad backup. That probably wouldn't help, but made our heads quiet. It was cold and then it was done. On the far side, the trail took us into forest again and worked up to a shoulder where the river turned into a sound instead of a thing you could touch. We didn't see the man. The tracks that should have been obvious weren't there, or we weren't seeing them because our brains were still sitting in the river watching a face go under. The rest of the day moved like a chore you do after something big. Your body keeps going because it knows how. The ridge back toward Hannigan rose in steps and we took them. We ate with our hands because we didn't want to cook. We drank when we remembered. Lena's shin had a quiet, angry line where the filament got her, and every time I looked at it, I felt the bells in my teeth again. By late afternoon, the air cooled in a way that had nothing to do with elevation. Cloud collected on the distant ice. We rounded a bend where the trees loosened and a view opened toward the road valley and saw a ranger truck down there at the trailhead. A square of green and a rectangle of dirt. Next to it was a sedan with a rear window patched with clear tape and cardboard that glittered with stuck glass. You could hear tape when the wind hit it. A little drum. At the trailhead, the ranger was talking to a guy in a ball cap with hands that would stop making small circles in the air. The man's car sat open, glass pebbled the dust. The glove box hung by one hinge. The ranger clocked us as we stepped out of the trees and had that calm face on, the one they practice for people who just came from a place where something is wrong. He asked how our trip went and we told him not the half story, the whole thing, where we met the man, what he asked, how he fell in behind us for a minute, the trip line and bells, the scraped bare can, the headlamp that swept in the short long pattern, the river, the rope, the limp. The braken guy looked at my leg when I said line and then pointed at the dust a couple feet from his rear tire. The print was shallow, left more by the way grit clings than by weight, but you could see the right foot turn in and a little drag on the toe, like the person who stood there had their body ask a question their ankle didn't want to answer. The ranger didn't say that a match because they do say that at a trailhead with no evidence bag and a dozen facts you can't prove. He just asked for our phone numbers in case someone needed a longer version later. We camped at night at a drive-in site like the kind you use on a road trip when all you want is a flat spot and a table. I could feel the river in the ground under the picnic bench even though we were miles from it. That's how the Chilliwack gets in your head. It's not loud. It's steady. We slept, but not really. In the morning, we did the ritual with the rental car keys, always in the same pocket each time you get out, and drove to Glacier for eggs and coffee served by a person who could tell we came from the hills by the dry pine smell in our clothes. We didn't make a speech. We didn't try to guess what the man wanted or what else he'd done. We just happened to be there when someone we didn't like very much tried to cross above his level and started to pay the price for it. A week later, my phone rang with a number that didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was the ranger. He said he was closing a loop. Another trail head further west very early. Another line of filament strung at shin height between two blackberry runners near a signpost. A guy jogging with a headlamp hit it, went down. and his friend behind him saw a shape in the dark next to a soft-top Jeep with a hand on a pocket knife at the seam where the plastic meets the frame. The friend tackled the shape. It was the man. In his day pack, they found small bells, a couple spools of monofilament, a short pry bar, and a ripped page from a guidebook that listed every backcountry camp on Copper Ridge. The ranger didn't use words like serial or pattern. He just said the word arrest, like a period at the end of a sentence that took too long to write. Then he thanked us for the report. In that way, that means I can't say more, but this mattered. We mailed the rope back to the climber with a note and some cash for a beer, and he texted a thumbs up and a keeping it, and we said no, which was only half true. The rope stayed with me in other ways. I could feel it in my hands when the river pressed at my knees, and again when the ranger said the word that closed the distance between our quiet loop on the ridge and a stranger's bad habit of turning people's trips into his work. We went back to Glacier a second time before flying out because it felt like the kind of thing that needed bookends. We ordered eggs the same way and watched a family in clean shirts draw arrows on a map. The kind of good plan you really allowed to have when you have and watched someone disappear face first in moving water. The river's color, green made heavy with silt, brown where shadow fell, kept showing up behind my eyes when I blinked. I couldn't turn it off. People ask if we do copper again. They mean it as a compliment to the place, and it deserves that. The ridge is beautiful. The lookout is a memory you can hold, and the valleys make a quiet you can put in your pocket for later. But I won't go back. Not because of one man or one night or one river that did exactly what rivers do. I won't go back because I know how it felt to stand with wet legs and a rope in my hands while someone we didn't know went under in a place that took our names and made them smaller. We got out, we drove down, we ate eggs, we returned the rope. There isn't more to it than that. I'm glad the phone call came. I am glad the page was in the pack and not in someone's pocket waiting for a next time. The rest of it stays with the ridge and with the river and with me in a way that makes the decision easy to state. Even if it's hard to explain, I'm not going back.